It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm, of course, Jeff Arbuckle, and this, of course, is Monster Mondays, presented to you by what else? Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays, well, they're for me to talk about monster movies. The month of May was Godzilla month, and Godzilla month comes to an official end, granted on June 3rd, with the brand new Godzilla King of the Monsters. Last week we discussed the 2014 Godzilla, and here we are along 5 years later and in the full-on midst of Legendary Pictures' Monsterverse. Godzilla tested the waters with the Big G taking on Mutos, so now let's go whole hog and bring in three of Godzilla's most well-known co-stars, King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Rodan. We also know we have a date in the very near future for Godzilla to meet up with King Kong, too. So, what can I tell you about Godzilla King of the Monsters that won't spoil anything in the movie? Well, honestly, not much. The primary synopsis is that it is 5 years later after Godzilla fought the Mutos. His destruction of San Francisco is ground zero for debate between science and the government on whether or not these so-called titans should be allowed to live without some sort of culling being done to protect humanity. Not only that, but there are those who have been personally affected by the battle in the city and have either lost loved ones or everything they own or both. What's worse is that Monarch, the clandestine group that is kind of behind studying these titans since 1954, isn't exactly forthcoming with the Senate committee that wants to take action on the titans. Their noncompliance to tell the Senate how many titans there are out there and that they are aware of has placed them in considerable danger of being shut down. To make matters worse, suddenly there's a whole mess of titans out now free on Earth and making a serious commotion all over the place. How many? All of them Monarch is aware of. That's how many are free. I really don't know what else I can say about the movie without spoiling any of the surprises. Many fans will want to know if King Kong shows up or if there's any mention of, say, Mechagodzilla, or if any other of the 11 or so titans not named Godzilla, Ghidorah, Mothra, Rodan, Muto, or Kong are recognizable guys from the classic Toho era. I honestly can't really say if I can talk about those types of things and still want to keep the spoiler free. As a Godzilla fan, I can say I had some of those answers already noodled out in my noggin before I went into the movie, and I wasn't terribly disappointed overall with what I was hoping to see in the movie. However, I will say that I am going to do a little bit of critique later of what I was disappointed in the movie. So I do want to be fair to this movie. Yes, the show I always do my three things that I like, but just keep in mind that I do have some critiques of this movie because this movie was a little bit of a disappointment to me, to be honest with you. So let's get to those three things that I liked about the movie. First, there is a great deal of care given by the makers of this movie for fan service. So much so, this is treated almost like a Godzilla's Greatest Hits album for fans. We want to see Ghidorah and Godzilla face off. We know that they're massive rivals and they have been connected at the hip for 55 years now. So we want to see multiple battles between the two. There are things about Ghidorah that fans might be excited to hear mentioned, like how he is actually named Monster Zero by Monarch and goes by that for the first 2/3 of the movie. Bear McQuarrie's score for this movie takes a lot of inspiration from the classic Godzilla themes. And, of course, Bear McQuarrie not only is usually been the music supervisor or the music composer for series like The Walking Dead, he's also done music for James Rolfe over at Cinemassacre. And James Rolfe, of course, is a gigantic Godzilla fan, and I'm sure that was exciting for those two to kind of talk about those types of things if they even had the opportunity to discuss what he was working on for this movie. The credits at the end even provide a nice section featuring Mothra's theme. So not only do we hear Godzilla's classic theme kind of revamped for the new age and for the new wave of these movies, but we also hear Mothra's theme during the credits. It's just a nice little touch. There are nice references to the original Rodan movie made as well, like where he's seen emerging from where Monarch has been keeping him under wraps. It's really kind of cool, especially if you're an old school monster fan. Generally speaking, this movie does its job to let fans know that it's done its homework. It knows what it wants to show you, and it really does try to give the fans what they want. Second, the monster designs for the Titans are really well done. You have classics who have been modernized to match the look of Legendary Pictures' Godzilla. You also have some opportunity to create some new creatures to help fill out some of the Titan ranks. What I really like about seeing all the creatures is that they seemingly have their own personalities too. It's not just Godzilla who gets to be himself. While there isn't a great deal of time provided during the movie to show each of these rampaging creatures be themselves, like Godzilla is, one thing I do recommend people do as much as possible during the end credits, try to read as many newspaper and web page headlines as you can. I think you'll find some that are definitely chuckle worthy. There were a couple that I saw that when I realized what it was saying, it cracked me up about some of these monsters. So it's really, they're nice little Easter eggs like that in the credits. You don't get too much time to really focus on it. I can't wait until this comes out on DVD and Blu-ray so that I can pause it and read each one, because it really sets this world of how Titans and humans will work together and live together going forward. Finally, you want fights? You want more monster scenes? Boy, howdy, you got them. King of the Monsters definitely took the criticism that many had of 2014's Godzilla to heart and upped the ante on scenes featuring the monsters, sprinkled them better throughout the 2 hour and 12-minute runtime, and lingered on them longer to help further the plot where it could really kind of help the human side of the story. The fight scenes are relatively brutal as well. As a fan, it is most definitely what we've been salivating for over these long 5 years. And, we were really able to kind of see how that stuff could be really done well with Kong Skull Island. Godzilla fighting the Mutos was great in the original, but we have these fan favorite creatures and we want to see a lot of them, and we get to see a lot of them. Now I will take my fan hat off and put on my sort of critic hat. Back last April, or back in April, I talked about the new Hellboy movie. It was kind of a hybrid of our Film Seizure at the Movie quick hit kind of reviews of new movies and Monster Mondays. Well, we're going to do that same thing here. So I do want to be fair to this movie and say that there were things that I definitely liked about it, but now I'm going to kind of take off that fan hat, put on my critic or sort of critic's hat, and talk about some of the things I was a little bit kind of disappointed in. Again, I'm not a real critic. I don't think that Jason and I have ever professed to being a critic in any episode of Film Seizure, but I will always say that I can say what I like, love, dislike, hate, or had some sort of unsettled feeling about. And with that, I do have to say that my expectations of this movie was not fully realized upon my first viewing. There were certainly things, like I've said, that I really, really liked. And there were a couple of moments with the creatures that I loved. There were some things that I didn't hate, but I really didn't love either. I'm curious to see this movie a second time with those expectations lifted, to see if this kind of grows on me a bit more, but I really have two primary critiques of this movie. First, I don't really mind so much the idea of Godzilla's greatest hits as kind of a basis for this movie. Having seen all of the Godzilla movies, I've seen a lot of stuff kind of be shown before, or things that they've copied. Like, for example, there have been big monster battles before in the Godzilla series, Destroy All Monsters and Final Wars, and they're very similar to one another. And when you see those types of movies, you definitely do kind of get a greatest hits feel, because, they're big monster mashup movies. So yeah, there are certain things that you expect to see from Godzilla that you've seen in other movies or from one of the other creatures or what have you. It's a little, it's one of those things where I don't really necessarily mind that feel. Um, However, that is also extended to the human plot of the movie, and that creates a little bit of a mess on that side of the movie. It almost feels like they wanted to give humans all these various things to do to try to not be squashed under the weight of the Titan battle going on everywhere. But it also became too much stuff to do. And also, you had characterizations that were like kind of disappointing and unfortunate to see really kind of undercut some of this movie. When you try to put too much stuff in, it makes for very bland and almost haphazard in its delivery because you can't let things play out. Various things happen. You think it should go to the human's plans for that thing to resolve itself, but then a guy comes in off screen to say, no, that won't work because of this new plot point device thing that just happened over here off screen. That's problematic because it rushes to a different outcome that the plot or writers demand, but don't really have the time or chance to let it play out naturally. It makes the humans not look helpless in the face of their possible extinction, but it definitely makes them look kind of dumb. Also, I'd not be terribly surprised if some diehard fans are kind of turned off by the greatest hits, quote unquote, feel, because most of the time, a greatest hits album is not really as good as a full album that only has a couple of hits but a lot more heart, soul, and consistency. For example, if I had to choose, I'd always choose Tom Petty's Wildflowers album over his greatest hits album, even if the bottom few songs on Wildflowers is nowhere near as great as any of the greatest hits tracks. There's a reason that is my favorite album and not his greatest hits album being my favorite. And I think most people would agree with that. If you had the choice between seeing a new TV episode of something, you don't want it to be what they would call a clip show where they're showing funny stuff from previous episodes or memorable stuff from previous episodes. You'd rather take the chance on trying something new. Now, of course, in this day and age, trying something new can always be dangerous when it comes to a fan base and pop culture, but I think most people would rather try something new instead of just seeing those greatest hits moments time and time again. That's kind of how I felt last night, how I felt this morning as I'm recording this. It doesn't feel it doesn't feel quite as earnest or quite as soulful as trying something new. My second critique comes in some of the fight scenes. Now, maybe it's the fact that I saw it on the IMAX screen, or maybe it was really an issue for others as well, but there are too many close-up shots in the fight scenes that you can't really make out what is happening. It's necks and limbs and teeth and tails, and you just can't tell what belongs to whom. Maybe the size of the IMAX screen or where I was sitting caused that sensation of confusion in my eyes, or maybe it was something else, and I'll get to that something else momentarily. Remember when the first couple of Transformers live-action movies came out? One of the big critiques from critics was that it was hard to tell what was happening in the close quarters fight scenes. It was just a mass of metal and robot parts, and that's kind of how I felt in King of the Monsters. There were plenty of shots that would establish the creatures, but there were way too many shots up close that made it hard to see who was doing what, and more importantly, who was winning. Older Godzilla movies would usually take a step back, even in the close quarter stuff. You can clearly see what's happening between the monsters, for better or worse. I didn't feel like things were too close in 2014's Godzilla. Despite how dark that movie was, I could see who was doing what. And I know that one of the big complaints that people have with giant monster movies is that it seems like most of the time it takes place during the night or during rain or during weather or whatever. And that's kind of true, at least in these last two Godzilla movies. However, that doesn't bother me nearly as much as just being sent for a loop and not really understanding what's going on in front of my face when things are too close and happening too fast. Despite all of that, my thoughts on this as it pertains to King of the Monsters is this. It was either a flub on the part of planning for the shots and effects, or it was something a little more, for a lack of a better term, kind of insidious. The 2014 Godzilla movie made money, but it didn't really set the world on fire with fans, critics, or general audiences here in the United States. You'd likely find more people who either flat out disliked it or thought it was only fair to Midland than you would find those who really did like it. Kong Skull Island was something a little more special. Plus, it was King Kong, a character who has hardly ever underperformed at the box office. But that movie just had a lot going for it with its setting, the timing, mixing it with kind of a Vietnam War movie type of feel. That was almost unilaterally loved far more than the 2014 Godzilla movie, and very likely what King of the Monsters legacy will be. But the questions that I have about this is, what if Warner Brothers didn't quite have as much confidence in this movie with it coming out in a pretty crowded summer? What if Legendary Pictures was simply hedging its bets for a mediocre box office draw? What if the number of monsters caused a change in plans in how special effects money was going to be used? The close-up effects would generally be a little easier to pull off cheaply, I would think. Pull back a bit to see faces, teeth, movement of neck muscles, arms, as well as legs, etc., and you're spending a lot of special effects budget. So any one or all of these reasons could cause the decision to cheapen up the effects by pulling in close and creating more jostled effects when monsters fall over, crash through buildings, etc. Maybe I'm starting to get old and having a harder time following up close, fast-paced action. But I'd be curious to see if others ran into the same problem when they were watching this. Look, I don't want to come down too hard on this movie. I probably spent more time talking about my critiques than I did the things that I like. I would say that I generally liked this movie for being a fun monster battle, at least when I could make heads or tails of what those monster battles were doing. Of the 30 plus Godzilla flicks, I'd say that this is a top 50% in the list of best to worst in the series, but it's hardly a top 10 entry in my book by any stretch of imagination. It's still fun and still takes steps in the right direction, I would say, to show that Americans can make Godzilla movies that appeal to Western moviegoers. With Godzilla vs. Kong already wrapped, I'm hoping the reviews of this movie doesn't cause a huge course correction or reshoots to kind of muddy up that entry in the series. But I will have positive energy and faith about that movie and judge it on its own merits when it comes out. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure each and every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays on Monday afternoons on filmseizure.com. Also, check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday morning.